last lecture, we talked about ways to protect your own computer and your own activities on the web. So it's probably a good time to ask the same question about our larger infrastructure system. Are there things the owners of the transportation system or the city-operated wastewater treatment facility aren't doing but should be that would help? It turns out there probably are. So in this lecture, we're going to look at another way of thinking about cybersecurity, one that is mostly not in vogue today. We're going to ask, in effect, whether or not we shouldn't stop planning to be perfect and instead think about cybersecurity more in terms of resiliency and recovery. As you'll see, there may be good reason to think that a better course is to plan for a little bit of failure. So, as we've spoken about at some length, the vulnerabilities of American infrastructure are quite real. Perhaps even more troubling, they're growing every day. In some ways, we are pushing our dependency on cyberspace forward faster than ever before, and the hole we are digging for ourselves is just getting deeper. Here's one example that caught my eye recently. In the state of Washington, wind power is increasingly being used to generate electricity. I think that's a fundamentally good thing. But the electric utilities sometimes have a small problem. During storms, the wind turbines generate too much power, more than the system can use. The oversupply of electricity might, in a worst-case scenario, overwhelm the grid and cause a blackout. To guard this, the Power Authority took the smart grid concept and turned it on its head. Now, typically, the idea behind a smart grid is that in times of high demand, the energy company can regulate the power consumption of its customers. For example, it can reduce energy use by modifying cooling tower temperatures and shift energy usage by commercial consumers to non-peak times, if that's necessary. Some automated manufacturing plants are just as happy to run their processes at night as during the day, if that'll save money. Smart grid technology, managed through the internet, evens out the peaks and valleys of electricity demand by consumers and lets producers plan for a more regular and constant generating schedule. In Washington, the Bonneville Power Administration reverses that structure in a really interesting way. When the wind turbines create too much supply, the administration offloads the excess power into the hands of volunteer customers. It might, for example, raise the temperature in a customer's water heater or heat ceramic bricks in an electric space heater. These systems are, in effect, thermal sinks, and when the crisis passes, the customers can return the stored energy to the grid. In other words, instead of smoothing out the peaks and valleys of demand, the administration evened out the variation in supply. These energy storage systems are operated at a distance. They're turned on and off through remote communications enabled by cyberspace technology. It's a wonderful technology, and yet a vulnerable one. For whenever any control system gets linked to the internet so that operators gain remote access, then so do those malicious actors who might want to hack the system to disable, disrupt, degrade, or destroy it. That's the 4 horrible Ds of computer hacking, remember? At a large scale, this might be a way to attack the power generation system. On a smaller scale, a hacker might be able to cause a heater in a single house to blow up as part of, say, an assassination attempt. Now, in fairness, these concerns are mildly speculative. But connections like those opened up by the Bonneville system create more than merely theoretical possibilities for action at a distance that goes down to the consumer level. As of now, we've mostly seen systems intrusions at the wholesale level, like, say, Stuxnet. Now, we have to imagine the consequences if a cyber intrusion could operate at the retail level and, say, could actually affect the heat of the ceramic bricks in your personal space heater. I've even seen research suggesting that hackers can attack an implantable insulin pump that's insulin-dependent diabetic life and reprogram it after it's inside the human body so that it administers an insulin overdose and kills the victim. The mind boggles. The Bonneville system, like all utility systems, is operated by a supervisory control and data acquisition, or SCADA system. And by now you know that SCADA systems are vulnerable. We saw it with the Department of Homeland Security's Aurora test. That's the test we talked about back in Lecture 1 that first demonstrated that intrusions into SCADA systems were capable of having real-world effects. In that case, a diesel generator was burned out and destroyed. And of course, the Stuxnet virus in Iran, which was the first piece of malware we talked about in this course, is exactly the same thing. An intrusion on a system that, at least in Iranian eyes, was a piece of critical infrastructure. The prospects of further SCADA attacks should heighten everyone's concern. In fact, in 2012, the U.S. Department of Energy's Inspector General told Congress that there were shortcomings in more than 1/3 of the smart grid projects that got federal funding. These shortcomings range from simple things like incomplete strategies for deploying and maintaining the new systems to more concerning flaws like vague and inadequate plans for responding to an attack. The threats and weaknesses in the system, the DOE Inspector General said, quote, may expose the systems to an unacceptable level of risk. And remember, SCADA systems run virtually every utility and manufacturing plant in America, and indeed around the globe. We can imagine any number of worst-case scenarios, ranging from blackouts to floods to even possibly a nuclear meltdown, all at the hands of cyber hackers. So clearly, we need to build a better cyber policy for the protection of critical infrastructure. But what does such a policy look like? Earlier in the course, we discussed economics, the role of government regulation. And I offered my own view that they tell us we should mostly let the market drive the answer. But what answer is that? If we could conceive of the right infrastructure protection policy, what would it be? Put another way, our approach to protecting our cyber systems today seems to be limited to sitting back and hunkering down in defense behind firewalls, antivirus programs, and intrusion protection systems. While those strategies certainly have their uses, we're entitled to ask whether the private sector ought not to be looking for a more effective solution. One way to approach a model of private sector cybersecurity is to become resigned, in a good way, to reality. To recognize that stuff happens is not just a mantra for the disaffected and unhappy. Rather, the reality of failure is a truism of the world, and it's a particular truism for the cyber domain. What this means is that, for better or worse, cyber breaches are inevitable. A cybersecurity strategy that is premised on the possibility of a perfect defense and 100% protection against attacks is a practical impossibility. In fact, some theorists even say that it is a theoretical impossibility, though that's a more debatable proposition. But if that's the case, maybe we need to change our strategy. Maybe our principal planning should be based on the assumption that at least some attacks will succeed. In other words, the only thing we can be 100% certain of is that we should prepare to fail. There are many systems that incorporate expectations of possible failure in the world, any one of which would serve as a good model for cybersecurity. The electric grid itself, in fact, is not designed to work 100% of the time. Everyone knows that blackouts can occur, both because of man-made errors and as a result of natural disasters. The principal goal of the electric grid management system is to make sure that power is rapidly restored. That means many backups to replace systems taken offline and an effective repair system for fixing the grid when it gets broken. Of course, we sometimes think that the repair system is less effective than it might be, but that's really a criticism of how the model is implemented, not the model itself. The point is that the system anticipates and plans for some level of failure. Cybersecurity policy could do the same. One particularly intriguing way to think about cybersecurity is to use, as a mental model, our medical and public health care system. And here, we're not talking about the flawed aspects of the healthcare system in terms of insurance and coverage. We're talking about the basic structure of diagnosis and treatment. In many ways, cybersecurity maps very well onto the healthcare system. We never expect everyone to remain perfectly healthy. We should never expect every computer system to remain perfectly free of malware. The similarity of the metaphor even extends to the names we use for computer malware. Virus and infection, for example. The implications in the design of a system that begins from an assumption of failure are significant. So let's spend a minute and see how that might work and what it might mean in practice. As in the medical system, our first set of cyber rules would deal with disease or infection prevention. In the healthcare world, these are often simple steps related to personal hygiene, washing your hands, drinking good, clean water, and the like. Similarly, in the cyber domain, good cyber hygiene is a strong candidate for success in limiting the number of infections. Good passwords, regularly changed, are like washing your hands. Making sure you think before you click on a suspect hot link to avoid malware infection is a lot like boiling your water before you drink it, and not drinking water that you suspect is unsafe. Just as wide swaths of disease can be prevented through simple cleanliness, many cyber infections can be readily prevented through simple equivalent steps. In fact, most of the things we talked about in the last lecture are just examples of putting this idea into practice. And much of the public policy that would advance these goals involves simple education, making sure the general public knows what safe computer hygiene is and how they can achieve it. Now, the next part of the analogy is vaccination. Almost every American has gotten his or her required vaccinations before they go to school. As a result, smallpox has been effectively eradicated and cases of polio are in steep decline. We can easily imagine using the same concept in relation to computer malware. Indeed, the programs that are most likely to be employed are, quite deliberately, called antivirus programs, purposely echoing the medical construct. For the private sector response, we could imagine a public relations campaign to encourage the use of up-to-date antivirus programs, just like the old-style public service announcements that reminded parents to make sure their children had gotten their shots before school. As we discussed in Lecture 9, in connection with the idea of government regulation, we could also think about an insurance or liability system for encouraging the adoption of a vaccination requirement. No antivirus certificate, no insurance. Or think about this. Scott Charney, who's the Vice President for Trustworthy Computing at Microsoft, has suggested that private sector software manufacturers should embed within their browsers a health certification function. In essence, every system would broadcast that it was using the best available and up-to-date antivirus system. When you, in turn, sought to connect to that system, you would first validate the vaccination certificate of the system you were connecting to. Depending on how serious we consider the problem to be, we could even imagine a mandatory vaccination model, like the one for school children. This last idea would obviously require governmental mandates that would make vaccination a condition of access to the web, which some might not like. Now, would that model be perfect? By now, you know that the answer is, of course not. Certificates could themselves be the targets of hackers, and individual users could choose not to vaccinate themselves. And as we've learned, antivirus programs don't work against new, zero-day malware attacks, just like flu vaccines don't prevent infection by a novel flu strain. But just like vaccination in the physical world, cyber vaccine requirements could cut down on some of the more common virus infections. We can take the medical model still further. When a disease outbreak does occur, our healthcare system reacts by doing two things. It floods resources to the site of the infection to combat it. We send Cipro, for example, to those exposed to anthrax. And it quarantines those who've been exposed to the disease so that they can't spread the infection by exposing others to it. That's why, for example, students who are ill are sent home from school. The cybersecurity model can also map onto this structure. When a company finds malware on its system, it typically floods resolution resources to the infected portions of the system to remove the infection. Companies often hire a cybersecurity company. One of the largest these days goes by the name Mandiant, and they send technicians to help out with specific techniques, a bit like coming on IV and the antibiotics. Of equal significance, the compromised computer server is often taken offline. In effect, it's quarantined till it's fixed. Some of this works in the anonymous attack on the security consultancy Stratfor that happened in late 2011. Now, Stratfor provides open source intelligence on national security risks around the globe. Its paying subscribers receive email briefings on a daily basis. So do other customers who subscribe to the free information update system that provides them with a simple summary of important daily events. When anonymous hacktivists penetrated the Stratfor system, they stole all of the company's customer email information, and some credit card information as well, apparently. In response, Stratfor was obliged to close its website for several weeks while working to fix the security vulnerabilities. Only after Stratfor was confident that the intrusion by Anonymous had been scrubbed was the website relaunched. Yeah, whether that confidence was justified remains to be determined. One issue that this entire thought experiment brings to mind is whether or not voluntary quarantine is enough. Stratfor, after all, took itself offline. What if it hadn't wanted to? Would its customers shun it, and would that be enough? Or do we need some way of creating a government-mandated quarantine system where, for serious cyber infections, the government can, if necessary, force someone to take their server offline? We have that capacity in the public health world, but whether or not it's used depends on the severity of the outbreak. We do it for bubonic plague, but not the typical flu. Bringing that authority into the cyber domain would be highly controversial. How would we define which cyber infections justified involuntary quarantine? Just imagine the outcry if private citizens were forcibly cut off from the internet because of a malware infection. There are still other aspects of our public health system that might have echoes in the cyber domain. For example, just as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention track the outbreak of various diseases, we need to think of the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, the DHS component that collects and distributes information about new cyber viruses that have been discovered, as the cyber equivalent of the CDC. This might require us to expand U.S. CERT and give it greater authority to collect information on cyber viruses. We also need excess hospital bed capacity to deal with epidemic infections, and we need something similar, excess bandwidth capacity, if you will, in the cyber domain to deal with denial of service outbreaks. Prior to September 11th, there was a nationwide shortage of emergency hospital bed capacity in America. Hospitals only increased their spare bed capacities in the wake of 9/11 and the subsequent anthrax and other scares. One hopes that it will not take a major cyber disaster to spur the private sector to build the spare bandwidth capacity it needs in time of crisis. Perhaps most importantly, however, the conceptualization of cybersecurity as an analog to public health brings with it a fundamental sea change in our thinking. It would help us recognize that an effort to prevent all cyber intrusions is as unlikely to succeed as an effort to prevent all disease. People will get infected. The goal is to prevent those infections that are preventable, cure those that are curable, and realize that when the inevitable illness happens, the cyber system, like the public health system, must be designed to continue operating. Most broadly, though, the analogy is obviously not perfect. The medical model starts us thinking about one of the most significant questions we can ask in cyber context. What does it mean to be resilient? The Department of Defense is defending an immense cyber system with more than 7 million computers. How do we ensure that it continues to operate even when under attack? and even if some aspects of that attack succeed. There's lots that can be said on the topic. In fact, resiliency in design is a whole separate area of academic study, and it certainly isn't limited in application to cyber systems. In the cyber domain, resiliency means that our systems are robust, adaptable, and capable of rapid response and recovery. As noted by Franklin Kramer, a national security expert with the Atlantic Council, to create system-wide resiliency, we need to use a variety and mixtures of techniques and mechanisms. Here are some of the building blocks. First, diversity. We tend to think that genetic diversity is good for enabling the survival and adaptability of species. Well, it turns out the same is probably true for cyber systems. One way to foster resiliency is to build cyber systems with multiple forms of programming in their architecture. That way, any single form of attack is not successful against the whole system. It turns out that it's really a good thing for your company to run both Microsoft and Linux, or maybe an Apple system. If one system gets hacked, chances are the other one will keep working. Another important building block of resiliency is redundancy. This means frequently creating snapshots or checkpoints of critical systems at a time and place when they are working in a known and stable condition. If you store that snapshot, the critical systems can be easily restored. You just use your Mr. Peabody and Sherman Wayback Machine. That's from an old cartoon I used to watch as a kid. And you go back in time to when your system was working. This is a little different than backing up your data. You're backing up the whole system, but it works the same way. And of course, to the extent restoration is not feasible, you can use an external backup system with copies of essential data and programs so that a compromised operating system can be replaced. We can also increase resiliency by how we actually build a system. Today, infrastructure providers link all of their activities together in a series of servers. We can do lots better by isolating and segregating different parts of a cyber system from each other. That way, any infected parts can be isolated and hived off so that a single failure will not cascade across the entire system. You'll remember, for example, that lots of the failures we've seen start with an email and a malicious document or a web link. So why do companies insist on continuing to put their email systems on the same servers that run the electricity generation plant? Air gaps and separate servers are good things. A corollary of this is the idea that we need to watch what is happening inside a cyber system, not just guard the entry points. Advanced persistent threats can be resident, unobserved within a cyber system for a long time. Malicious activity within the system may be infrequent and difficult to detect. So internal monitoring is necessary to give a better sense of when and how intrusions are occurring. In fact, one of the most important things a company can do to catch intrusions is to watch what traffic is leaving its system, because that's where the real evidence of intrusion will be found. Most intrusions call back to headquarters for instructions periodically. Many others are there to steal information and send it back to their creators. So watching the outbound traffic can tell you whether or not you have an intruder inside. And if, as we've discussed, cybersecurity is often a human problem, then big infrastructure operators need to think hard about who gets access to which portions of their systems. Many intrusions are made by insiders who take advantage of their access to install malicious software. In addition to better personnel screening, which can keep out the spies, another effective precaution is to ensure that the people who are given access to a system get the least amount of privileged access necessary to achieve their purposes. A final component of resiliency is, surprisingly, to foster change. If targets of attack are concentrated in a single place and protected by an unchanging defense, a malicious intruder has a fixed target or objective against which to direct his resources. If an infrastructure provider distributes the targets widely and varies the defense, its system will be better able to frustrate attack. Randomness, unpredictability, and even deception introduce variability into the mix and make a successful attack more difficult to achieve. Taken together, these various tactics, which we've only summarized here in a short form, can create a more resilient system, one that is not immune to failure, but is less likely to be hacked and capable of operating even when subject to intrusion or attack. There's one other issue to talk about to complete our discussion of protecting critical infrastructure: the idea of a hackback. As you'll recall, a hackback involves, in its most simple form, hacking into an attacker's computer to defeat his attempts to hack you. Here, we're transitioning from our consideration of resilience to focus on deterrence. Why? Well, one way to make yourself less vulnerable is to make yourself very dangerous to attack. There are actually many flavors of hackback. They include measures that cause damage to a would-be attacker, measures that lure and ensnare hackers with honeypot traps, or even preemptive attacks on parties who have shown some intent to hack. In the cyber world, there are also active defensive measures that you can take if you're subject to an attack. Tactics that go by names like IP flatlining, where you use programs to effectively take your adversary offline, or beaconing, where you put a tracker into your own data so you can find out who stole it, or data traps, where you lure attackers in and then give them false data, often with beacons in it. Collectively, these types of defensive countermeasures go by the name of hackback. Now, as we considered in our lecture on cybercrime, most active defenses are almost certainly crimes under US law. After all, my attack on my attacker will almost certainly involve accessing a computer without the authorization of its owner, either the malicious actor and attacker himself, or sometimes even an innocent intermediary. And so, almost every aspect of private sector self-help is, in theory, a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. There are even more stringent limits on hackbacks if the attacker is, say, the representative of a nation-state, as in the case of China-sponsored hacker groups we've been talking about throughout these lectures. That's because foreign policy is something we leave to government. It's actually illegal in the United States for a private corporation to conduct diplomacy. Laws like the Neutrality Act and the Logan Act prohibit private actors from waging war or negotiating with foreign powers on behalf of the United States, because that's considered a government function. So what is a company to do if an imminent attack against its infrastructure is coming from a state-sponsored attacker? Does it rely on the government? Or will its efforts to defend itself violate the law? Will the first shot in the first cyber war be fired by a private company? These are not theoretical questions. Despite the legal uncertainties, new companies are springing up all around the country with the sole purpose of providing offensive response options for companies under attack. For example, one new company, called CrowdStrike, offers services that include counter-espionage techniques, hostile target dismantling, and denial and deception. They proudly boast, quote, "We help your enterprise go on the offensive against today's most advanced adversaries," end quote. And they're not alone. The specter of private cyber conflict is well and truly upon us. One final real-world example will give you some idea of the scope and difficulty of the problem faced by infrastructure protectors, and all the rest of us too. As we discussed in Lecture 2, some researchers in Germany began in 2012 to publicize a project they called HoneyNet. It's a graphic representation of malware attacks happening around the globe in real time. If you haven't already visited their website, go to map.honeynet.org, and you can see the attacks as they spread across the globe, red for attackers and yellow, naturally, for the honeypots that catch them. The geographic scope and relentless frequency of the attacks is enough to scare almost anyone. And bear in mind that the map is just a small sample of everything that is actually happening. When you see the map, you realize the breadth of our vulnerability. For me, at least, it suggests that playing only firewall defense is a losing strategy. And that in turn convinces me that we need to systematically consider going on the offense and also plan for failure. Both, I think, are the powerful realities of the cyber domain today. In some ways, the concept of resiliency is about as optimistic a vision as we can hope for when faced with the reality of cyber attacks. Like illness and disease, we understand that cyber infections are endemic in the world, but perhaps they aren't, or don't have to be, all that catastrophic. Absent the cyber equivalent of the Black Plague, we can have a very realistic expectation that our cyber systems can and will recover from attack if we build them the right way. And at a time when we are increasingly dependent on those same cyber systems for almost everything we do, it is rather comforting to have that image of resiliency in our minds. Marry that to a little bit of deterrence, and maybe, just maybe, we'll have a good model for stability in this ever-changing cyber world. And with that, we're nearing the end of this lecture series. In our next and final lecture, we'll summarize some of the things that I hope you've learned, and we'll also take the opportunity to peer into our crystal ball and see what the future of cybersecurity looks like. I look forward to talking to you then.